In the green heart of Ashmere Valley, nestled between rolling hills and sleepy woods, there stood an old stone keep, known by the few who remembered it as Willow Keep. Ivy wound gently around its towers, and ancient willow trees leaned in close, as though whispering to its weathered walls. It was the year 1186, and while kingdoms clashed and kings debated far beyond the valley, life in Ashmere moved at a gentler pace. The River Lynn flowed like a lullaby through meadows of heather and thyme, past grazing sheep and sleepy cottages with thatched roofs. The story begins on a quiet spring morning. A soft mist curled above the fields, and the sun rose slowly behind a hill, turning the sky from gray to soft lavender. The birds had only just begun to sing when a single horse approached the keep, its rider cloaked in faded blue wool, the hood drawn low. The rider was a woman, Isolde of Edenwood, once the daughter of a noble family, now a quiet seeker of peace. She had ridden through forest and field, past empty shrines and crumbling bridges, seeking a place forgotten by the world. The Willow Keep had been her late mother's home long ago, and it was said to still belong to their bloodline, though no one had lived there in many years. She paused on a rise, looking down at the keep. The old gatehouse stood strong, but tired, and wildflowers bloomed along the worn path that led up the hill. Crows wheeled lazily in the sky above. Isolde took a slow breath. She was home, or something close to it. She dismounted, her boots sinking into damp moss, and walked the last distance on foot. The horse, a dappled mare named Elric, followed without protest. As they approached the wooden gate, Isolde placed her hand upon its rough surface. She half expected resistance, but it creaked open with a whisper, as though the keep had been waiting for her. Inside the courtyard, grass had overtaken the cobblestones, and wild roses tangled around the old well. The stone walls, though aged, stood firm. The main hall's tall doors were closed, but not locked. She pushed them open, letting sunlight spill into the dusty interior. The air smelled of wood, stone, and thyme. It was quiet, wonderfully, peacefully quiet. Isolde spent the morning wandering the keep. The great hall still held remnants of carved chairs and cold hearths. In the upper chambers, light filtered through latticed windows onto faded tapestries. In one room, she found a cradle, untouched for decades, and in another, a tall bookshelf, its volumes slouched with age. She chose a room with a view of the valley and unpacked her things. A few books, a worn journal, a carved wooden comb, and her mother's silver pendant. She lit a beeswax candle and set it in the window, letting its soft glow meet the morning sun. By noon, she had started a fire in the old hearth and boiled a small pot of lentils and herbs. As the scent drifted through the hall, birds chirped from beyond the arrow slits, and a warm breeze stirred the curtains. That evening, Isolde sat at the edge of the orchard behind the keep. The trees were old, their branches heavy with moss, but some still bloomed. She plucked a single apple blossom and held it gently in her hand. The sky turned golden, then amber, then soft rose as the sun sank beyond the hills. From here, the valley looked untouched by time. Sheep moved like clouds across the hillsides, and the river shimmered below like a ribbon of light. Far in the distance, she could see the lanterns of a small village beginning to flicker. This was what she had come for, not silence, but serenity. A life far from courts and titles, away from the sharp tongues of nobles and the cold weight of expectation. She whispered softly into the breeze, "Let this place remember me gently." And the wind answered in rustling leaves, as though it agreed. Night came quietly. Isolde returned to her chamber and lit a second candle. She brushed out her hair and sat by the window, listening to the gentle sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crackle of the fire in her hearth. She opened her journal and began to write. First night at Willow Keep. It is not haunted, only lonely. I feel it watching me kindly, like a house that is tired of being empty. I hope it will let me stay. Afterward, she tucked the journal away, lay upon the old feather mattress, and pulled the wool blanket to her chin. The stars blinked above the hills, and the willow trees whispered their lullabies below. Sleep came easily, and for the first time in many years, Isolde dreamed not of loss, but of soft rivers and distant bells. The days that followed were wrapped in softness. Each morning, Isolde woke to the golden hush of dawn filtering through the window's woven glass. She would lie still for a moment, listening to the hush of leaves outside, the sleepy murmur of the river far below. There were no horns, no footsteps of servants, no whispered court gossip behind her door, just the hush. She began to settle into a rhythm, gentle and slow, like a lullaby from the earth itself. After rising, she would walk the grounds with Elric. The mare was content, grazing freely in the orchard or resting in the shade of the crumbling stable, now overgrown with ivy and forget-me-nots. The birds were always first to greet her, hopping along the courtyard stones or darting between trees, as though they had missed the presence of people and had waited for her return. One morning, Isolde ventured behind the keep's south wall, where a path of overgrown stones led to a forgotten garden. It was hidden by brambles, but beneath the tangle she saw order. Raised beds edged with smooth stones, the remains of trellises, once heavy with vines, and a central fountain now dry and filled with moss. With gloved hands and patient breath, she cleared away the ivy. Beneath it, she discovered things the world had long forgotten: a carved bench, a rusted lantern, the faint outlines of a sundial, and etched in the stone rim of the fountain, the words, "Time softens all things." She repeated the phrase quietly to herself, running her fingers over the letters. The words seemed both ancient and deeply personal. A message, perhaps, from someone who had once sat just where she stood now, watching the sky pass slowly over this quiet garden. Isolde spent her days gently restoring the space. She found seeds in the cellar, lavender, thyme, poppies. Some she recognized from her childhood, others were unfamiliar. She sowed them into the soil with care, humming old lullabies her mother used to sing. She even spoke to the plants, not out of superstition, but as a way to feel less alone. "Grow slowly," she would say. "No rush. No one here minds." The garden responded in its own way. By the end of a week, green shoots emerged shyly from the earth, and bees began to visit again, lazily buzzing from petal to petal, like drowsy sentinels of spring. One day, while digging near the base of a crumbled wall, Isolde's trowel struck something hard. She knelt, brushed away the soil, and uncovered a small wooden box bound in rusted iron. The latch had long since given way. Inside lay letters, wrapped in a cloth now frayed by time, sealed with red wax, their ink faded but still legible. The first letter began, "To the one who finds this, I hope you read it with kindness. This garden was once a place of laughter, of secrets shared, and songs sung in twilight. My name is Aldrich. I was a healer here, and in love once. I hope the garden grows for you as it did for us." Isolde folded the letter gently and placed it in her lap. There were others, more letters, glimpses into lives long past. The final one ended with, "We planted a pear tree the spring before he left. I have not dared to look at it since. But I hope it still blooms, and I hope someone will remember." Isolde looked up, heart tender. Near the wall, she had noticed a tree with twisted limbs and soft green buds just beginning to blossom. The pear tree. That evening, Isolde brought a candle to the garden and placed it beside the tree. She sat on the stone bench and read the letters by the flickering light, the breeze curling softly around her. The words were not grand histories of war or court. They were quiet, human memories. Laughter, longing, the softness of another's hand. She did not know Aldrich or his lost love, but she felt their presence in the garden, like the hush that follows a hymn. Before returning to her chamber, she whispered to the tree, "He remembered you, and now, so do I." The keep had begun to shift around her. At night, its stone walls no longer felt cold. They seemed to breathe gently with the breeze, holding the warmth of the hearth. The hallways, once hollow with dust, now echoed softly with her steps. Even the old bell tower, long unused, seemed to lean slightly toward her, as if listening. She often wrote in her journal by candlelight, beside the fire. There is magic in quiet things. Not spells, not potions, but the kind of magic that lives in forgotten gardens, in old letters, in the stillness before sleep. One night, as rain tapped gently against the window panes, Isolde dreamed. She was walking through the garden, barefoot in soft grass, and the pear tree stood tall, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beneath it sat two figures, a man and a woman, hand in hand, their eyes turned upward toward the stars. They did not speak, but their presence was filled with peace. She felt no fear, no sorrow, only calm. As she drew near, the woman looked at her and smiled, then faded into the blossoms. When Isolde woke, her pillow was damp with tears, not of sadness, but of some release she couldn't quite name. The following morning, the sun returned. She opened the window and let the light flood her chamber. The pear tree, she saw, had bloomed fully in the night, delicate white blossoms trembling in the breeze. And somewhere deep within Willow Keep, the hush that had slept for decades stirred again, not in sorrow, but in memory. Isolde breathed in the scent of the morning and whispered, as she did every dawn, "Thank you for letting me stay." And the wind, as always, whispered back. The bell tower's lullaby. Summer approached quietly in Ashmere Valley, not with fanfare, but with long, warm days and honey-slow afternoons. The grasses grew tall and golden along the edges of the hills, and butterflies danced above the wildflowers that now thickened around the keep's walls. Isolde's days passed gently. She awoke with the birdsong, worked in the garden through the early morning light, and spent her afternoons reading, mending, or writing by the hearth. In the evenings, she sat beneath the pear tree, whose blossoms had given way to tiny green fruit. She watched the stars blink into view, one by one, above the treetops. The silence no longer felt like absence. It had become company. One afternoon, while walking along the upper galleries of the keep, Isolde passed a narrow arched doorway she had not noticed before. Vines had grown thick over it, curling around its frame like fingers guarding a secret. Curious, she cleared the ivy gently away and found a spiral staircase descending behind the door. The stones were worn smooth, and a faint scent of candle wax and cold iron rose from below. She lit her lantern and descended carefully. At the base of the stairway, she discovered an arched passage that led to a large, circular chamber. High above, a bell hung in its tower, silent but dignified, its bronze surface dulled with time. Around the room were benches, narrow windows, and a collection of ropes and pulleys that once operated the bell. This was the old bell tower, once used to mark the hours or to summon those who lived on the estate. Now it sat in peaceful retirement, dust resting on every stone, as though even time itself had decided to sleep. Isolde walked to the bell and laid her hand on the rope. She did not ring it, not yet, but simply stood there, feeling the weight of stillness. The rope swayed slightly in her hand, like the breath of something long dormant. A wooden plaque hung near the base of the bell, carved with faded words. "Let the bell speak only when hearts must listen." She read the line aloud, quietly. It stayed with her all evening. Over the next few days, Isolde began to clean the bell tower. She dusted the benches, mended the lanterns, and opened the windows to let in the breeze. The space felt sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the way a favorite lullaby feels sacred, or a letter from long ago. It was a place made not for grandeur, but for pause. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the hills, she brought a small stool to the tower and sat beside the rope. She did not ring it. Instead, she wrote, "This tower holds stories that were never shouted, only whispered. I wonder how many times this bell called someone home." She imagined a boy running through the fields at the sound of the bell, a mother lighting a candle, a knight returning late to the valley, hearing its chime in the distance and knowing he was near shelter. Isolde closed her eyes. She didn't know their names, but she felt their presence, not as ghosts, but as echoes, kind echoes, gentle ones. A few days later, something unexpected happened, a knock at the gate. It was so soft she thought at first it was the wind, but then it came again, a little firmer, a knock, then silence. Isolde descended the stairs, heart calm but curious. It had been weeks since she'd seen another soul. She opened the gate slowly and found a young boy standing there, holding the reins of a thin, weary donkey. His clothes were simple but clean, and his eyes were the color of wet earth, tired, cautious but not frightened. He bowed slightly. "Forgive me, my lady. I was told there might be someone here." Isolde smiled gently. "You were told right. What brings you to Willow Keep?" "I'm called Bram," he said. "My grandmother sent me. She said the healer of the keep might still live." Isolde tilted her head, kindly. "The healer?" She remembered one from long ago. "Aldrich," she said. "I hurt my arm working the fields." She thought, perhaps this place still held something of him. Isolde looked at the boy's arm. It was wrapped in linen, damp and stained. She guided him inside, slowly and gently, and fetched her small chest of herbs and salves. She had learned some healing in her youth, from her mother and from books forgotten in corners. She washed the boy's arm with warm water, crushed lavender and comfrey into a poultice, and rewrapped the limb with fresh linen. Bram sat quietly the whole time, eyes wide but unafraid. "Thank you, my lady," he said when she was done. Isolde smiled. "You may call me Isolde. Would you like something warm to eat?" He nodded, and she made a small fire and served him lentils and oat bread with honey. He ate slowly, politely, though she could tell he was hungry. Before he left, Isolde gave Bram a small bundle of herbs and instructions for his grandmother. He bowed again at the gate, the donkey snorting softly beside him. "She'll be glad to know someone still lives here," he said. "Tell her the garden grows again," Isolde replied, "and the pear tree blooms." Bram nodded, smiled, and turned down the taff, disappearing into the soft light of dusk. That night, Isolde returned to the bell tower. She lit the lanterns, sat beside the rope, and thought of Aldrich, of the letters, of the boy who had come seeking healing from a memory. She looked up at the great bell and with steady hands pulled the rope once. The bell rang, not loudly, but with a deep, peaceful tone. It drifted across the valley like a voice calling through sleep. It was not a summons, it was a lullaby. The bell's single chime faded slowly into the still air of twilight. It drifted over the hills, passed through the orchard, and stirred the grass in the garden. Somewhere in the village below, an old woman lifted her head from her chair and whispered, "They remembered." And far above in the keep, Isolde sat quietly beside the bell rope, eyes closed, heart full. She hadn't realized how deeply she had longed for a moment like this, not loud or triumphant, but gently connected to something larger than herself, a breath shared between centuries. In the days that followed, Isolde returned to her quiet rhythm, but something had changed. The keep felt more alive, not bustling, not busy, just quietly aware. The wind through the halls no longer whispered of emptiness. Instead, it felt like memory, like the soft breath of a house remembering how to be a home. She spent more time in the garden, carefully tending to each shoot and blossom. The lavender grew in fragrant sprays. The thyme crept along the stones, and the pear tree, steadfast and patient, swayed gently as though it had heard the bell and sighed with relief. Every afternoon, she returned to the old wooden box of letters, the ones written by Aldrich, and read one by the window light. Each letter revealed more of his life and the love he shared with a man named Tomund, a quiet, kind-hearted scribe who once cared for the Abbey Library just beyond the valley. They had lived quietly, as many had to in those days, their love hidden in glances and late walks, in pressed flowers between pages and the music of shared silence. One letter, written near the end of the bundle, read, "We planted the garden not to feed, but to remember. A garden is not just for the living. It's for the ones we love to return to, even if only in spirit. I don't know if I will see him again, but if anyone ever comes here, I hope they'll sit in the shade of the pear tree and feel us there, even just a little." Isolde pressed the page to her chest. Outside the window, the breeze rustled the branches gently, almost like a sigh. Later that week, she wandered to the abbey ruins across the hills. It was a gentle walk, past low stone walls and meadows where wild deer grazed in the distance. The abbey had long since collapsed, but its foundation remained. Low, moss-covered stones, outlining where once prayers had echoed and candles had glowed. Ivy trailed along the edges of the archways, and fragments of stained glass glimmered in the soil like forgotten gems. There, in the hollow of what once was the library, Isolde knelt and ran her fingers over the earth. She imagined Tomund here, his ink-stained fingers brushing across parchment, his eyes soft with quiet wisdom. She brought a candle, lit it, and placed it within the old altar stone. As the flame flickered, birds circled overhead in the amber sky. "I don't know your face," she whispered, "but I know your words, and I will keep them safe." That night, Isolde returned to Willow Keep with a small bundle of wildflowers and placed them beneath the pear tree. She knelt in the garden, her hands resting in her lap, and closed her eyes. There was no voice, no ghost, no sudden wind, just peace. A peace that lingered even after she rose and returned to her chamber. Days passed. The garden grew. Her journal filled with quiet entries. And slowly, Isolde found herself changing too. The lines of tension in her shoulders softened. Her dreams grew deeper, her breath slower. She began writing letters, not to send, but to keep. Letters to her mother, to her younger self, to Aldrich, to Tomund, to no one in particular. She sealed each one with wax, tucked them into a wooden box, and placed it on the windowsill, where the sun could find it each morning. One such letter read, "To whoever walks these halls next, the keep is not empty. It breathes, it remembers, and if you listen closely, you'll hear it hum, a lullaby made of leaves, old stones, and distant bells. Rest here. You are welcome." Then, one rainy evening, a second visitor arrived. This time, it was an old man in a dark green cloak, hunched slightly with a weathered walking stick. Isolde heard his approach before he knocked, the careful rhythm of his boots on stone. The way rain hit his hood, she opened the gate and met his kind, wrinkled face. His eyes were pale blue, soft with age and memory. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently. "I used to walk these hills long ago. Thought I'd see if the keep still stood." "It does," Isolde replied, smiling. "And it remembers you." The man chuckled. "Does it now?" She welcomed him inside, warmed him by the hearth, and served him hot tea with herbs from the garden. He looked around the hall with a distant, tender gaze. "My name's Emmerich," he said after a moment. "My mother used to bring me here as a child. Her brother lived here, a healer. Aldrich, I think." Isolde set down her cup gently. "He left letters," she said. "I found them." Emmerich's eyes grew glassy. "I never knew much of him. Only that he was kind and quiet, and that he loved someone whose name was never said aloud." "Thomund," Isolde said. Emmerich nodded slowly. "Yes, that sounds right." They sat in silence a while. The rain tapped gently against the stone. Before Emmerich left the next morning, Isolde led him to the garden. The pear tree stood tall, its leaves dancing in the morning breeze. Beneath it, the soil was rich and soft, flowers blooming in careful circles. He stood before it, hat in hand, and whispered, "They would have liked this." "They do," Isolde said softly. He left her with a worn leather pouch of dried seeds. "From my mother's garden," he said. "Add them to yours." And then he was gone, walking slowly down the path, the valley opening before him like a painted dream. That night, Isolde lit a lantern in the bell tower. She didn't ring the bell, it wasn't time. But she sat there a long while, holding a letter in her hands, and listening to the hush of memory, the hush of peace, the hush that comes before the gentlest kind of sleep. The painted cloister, the first golden days of summer settled gently over Ashmere Valley. Warm winds brushed through the orchard, and the pear tree's small fruits began to swell with promise. Bees buzzed low across the garden paths, and time itself seemed to slow down, as if it too had taken to resting in the shade. Inside Willow Keep, Isolde discovered another forgotten place. It happened on a quiet afternoon, as she was rearranging some of the books and small belongings she had collected in the north wing. Behind an armoire too heavy to move alone, she noticed something odd. The outline of a door in the stone wall, nearly lost beneath plaster and dust. She pressed gently. It gave way with a low creak, revealing a narrow hallway, untouched for decades. The air was cool and still, as if the corridor had been holding its breath all this time. Lantern in hand, she followed the path, her steps soft on the stone floor. The hallway turned and descended slightly, then opened into a small cloister, a square courtyard encircled by covered walkways, hidden deep within the keep's foundation. Here, the sunlight filtered down from above through openings in the roof, illuminating a garden of ferns, mosses, and pale flowers that had somehow survived the passing years. But what caught her breath was the walls. Each side of the cloister was painted with fading murals, peaceful scenes of harvests, rivers, and faces full of quiet joy. Children holding hands, an old woman spinning wool, two men sitting beside a fire, sharing bread, a cloaked healer tending a wound beneath the boughs of a tree. The style was delicate, not grand, and the brushwork spoke of care rather than fame. These were not the works of royal artists. They were the paintings of someone who loved deeply and simply. In the center of the cloister stood a stone bench, worn but intact. Carved along the edge in careful script were the words, "Not all love needs to be remembered by name. Let peace be their legacy." Isolde stood in stillness for a long while. She returned to the cloister often after that. It became her place of stillness, deeper even than the bell tower, a chamber below the world, where time did not chase and voices did not demand. She cleaned the bench, brought fresh flowers, and once even played a soft melody on a flute she'd found in the storage chests. The cloister listened kindly, its painted faces smiling faintly in the light. One afternoon, while brushing away moss near the corner of one mural, she discovered a signature etched delicately into the wall, T.A. Tommond and Aldrich, together. She traced the letters with her fingertip and whispered, "You did leave a mark, after all." Soon after, a second letter arrived, not one from the box, but a real, newly written letter, carried by a young messenger who appeared at her gate with a shy smile. It was from Bram, the boy she had once healed. He now worked in the village far below the hills and had written to thank her. His arm had mended well, he said, and he had told others about the woman in the keep who lived quietly and kindly among the stones. But the keep had not left her alone. It had remembered her, welcomed her, shared its stories, its silence, its echoes of love. She felt now like a steward, not an owner, the keeper of whispers, the gardener of memory. That evening, she visited the cloister once more. She brought a candle, a quill, and a small piece of parchment. She sat on the stone bench, and in the hush of the underground light, she wrote, "To those who come after, if you find this place, walk softly. The stones carry the weight of stories. Love lived here and still lingers. May you feel it in the quiet. May you carry it gently forward." She folded the note and placed it between two stones near the mural, just beneath the signature. As she rose, the candle flickered, and for a moment, just a moment, the painted faces on the walls seemed to glow with warmth. That night, sleep came to her as gently as a sigh. She dreamed of bell chimes drifting through mist, of garden blossoms opening beneath starlight, of letters carried by wind and folded into the folds of time. And in the dreams someone whispered, "You are part of the story now." The sound of rain on stone. The rain came softly at first, a whisper on the leaves, a rhythm in the distance. Isolde awoke before dawn to the gentle tapping of droplets against her chamber window. The sky was still dark, the hills blanketed in mist, and the keep itself seemed to hum with contentment. She wrapped herself in a wool cloak and padded barefoot to the great hall. The fire had long since faded to embers, but the scent of ash and beeswax lingered. Outside, the world breathed slowly. She stepped into the courtyard and lifted her face to the rain. It was warm, not cold, and fell with the hush of lullabies. The ivy along the stone walls swayed gently, drinking it in. For hours, the rain continued, steady, soothing, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to rest. It filled the cracks in the flagstones and made music as it dripped from the eaves. Birds huddled quietly beneath the branches. The garden glistened, and in that gentle weather, Isolde found new slowness. She returned to the bell tower. The steps were damp. Her lantern flickered, but the room welcomed her just the same. She sat near the rope and listened. The bell itself did not ring, but the air around it seemed filled with low echoes, memories stirred by the weather. She took out her journal and began to write. Rain has a way of softening everything. Edges blur, time slows, silence becomes music. Today I remembered a story my mother used to tell me about a healer who grew poppies on the edge of a cliff. People said he could hear the sea in their petals. I wonder if Aldrich knew that story. I wonder if I am becoming part of it now. She paused, watching droplets slide down the tower's arched window. Below, in the garden, the pear tree trembled gently under the rainfall. Its small fruit, now round and pale green, nearly ready. Isolde smiled. When the storm grew stronger, she lit more candles and stayed inside, exploring corners of the keep she had yet to truly see. In the west wing, behind a warped wooden door, she found a small music room. A harpsichord rested beneath a dusty cloth, and an old music book lay open upon the stand. The pages were curled, the notes handwritten in patient ink. She sat at the bench and gently played a single key. The sound was soft and true, aged but alive. She tried a simple melody, one she remembered from childhood. The Morning Bird, a lullaby once sung in Edenwood. Her fingers moved slowly, reverently, as though not to disturb the dust. The notes lingered in the room like candle smoke. The next morning, the rain faded. The sky broke open with pale light, and the garden glowed with renewal. Puddles mirrored the sky, and the scent of fresh earth rose from the ground like an offering. Isolde wandered barefoot into the garden. She moved slowly, brushing droplets from leaves, checking each plant, each bloom. The poppies had opened in the rain, crimson and gold. The thyme shimmered with beads of water. Under the pear tree, she found something unexpected. A small stone, flat and round, had been placed at its base, and upon it a single feather. No one had come through the gate. No footprints marked the muddy path. But someone, or something, had left this quiet gift. She bent to examine it. The feather was dark gray, tipped with white, from a dove or wood pigeon. The stone was smooth and clean, as though it had been freshly drawn from the river. She smiled to herself. "Thank you," she whispered, though she did not know who she was thanking. And perhaps that didn't matter. That evening, she returned to the music room. She brought fresh candles, a cloth to clean the keys, and a cup of tea sweetened with honey. She sat once again and opened the music book. This time, she began to compose. Not for court, not for anyone else, just for the keep. A song of rain, of stones and feathers, of healing and memory. She called it the sound of rain on stone. That night, as sleep settled over the valley like a warm shawl, Isolde dreamed once more. She walked through the cloister. The murals were bright again, colors restored, faces vivid and kind. Tomond and Aldrich sat beneath the painted trees, their fingers laced. When she passed, they nodded, not solemnly, but with quiet joy. She walked through the garden. The pear tree reached toward the stars. Petals fell like snow, and around her, letters drifted through the air, caught in soft wind, never lost. At the edge of the dream, a voice, neither old nor young, whispered, "Everything remembered lives again." The map in the candlelight. Autumn arrived with grace. The leaves turned to fire and honey, painting the trees with soft golds and rusted reds. Wind carried the scent of apples and wood smoke through the quiet valleys. The stone walls of the keep, warmed by summer, now cooled with the breath of the coming frost. Isolde began her mornings wrapped in thick wool shawls, watching the mist roll over the fields from the high tower. The village below had grown still. Fewer carts, fewer voices, as though the land itself was preparing for sleep. Inside the keep, the warmth came from within. One crisp afternoon, while searching for dry parchment in the old scriptorium, Isolde came across a locked drawer. The key had long been lost, but the wood had weakened over time, and with gentle force, it gave way. Inside lay a rolled map, tied with faded ribbon, its edges frayed, ink soft with age. She carefully unrolled it across the long oak table. Dot. It was a map of the valley, but older than any she had seen. The outline of the keep was there, marked not as Willow Keep, but as the House of the Vale. There were other markings too. A cross where the cloister now lay, a small spiral on the hillside to the east, and just beyond the orchard, a circle with words barely legible, the Steps of Silence. Isolde leaned closer. The ink was almost gone, but not quite. She copied the symbols carefully onto new parchment. Her hands steady, she did not know what the spiral meant, but she knew what she would do the next day. At dawn, she packed a basket with bread, cheese, and a wool blanket. She tucked the copied map into her coat and followed the eastern path through the Finning woods. Birdsong accompanied her. The wind whispered through the turning leaves. The sky, overcast but gentle, kept the light soft on the land. After an hour's walk, the path curved sharply, rising into a hill she had never climbed before. At its crest, she found it. A hollow space marked by 12 flat stones in a perfect spiral, each no larger than a foot, weathered, worn smooth by time. In the center, a single stone bowl, cracked and moss-lined, filled with clear rainwater. The air was still. No bird sang, no wind moved. She stepped carefully, one stone at a time, toward the center. It felt like walking through memory. At the final step, she sat cross-legged before the bowl and waited. Minutes passed. Then a voice, soft as wind in feathers, echoed behind her ear. Here we leave the burdens. She turned. No one was there, but the feeling remained. She took a breath, reached into her coat, and removed a single folded letter she had written weeks before. It was addressed to her mother, unsent, never meant for the world. She unfolded it slowly, read the words once more in silence, and then, gently, laid it in the bowl. The water rippled. The letter began to sink. And as it did, Isolde felt something inside her loosen, not vanish, but shift, like ice melting deep below the surface of a lake. She walked back slowly. The mist followed her like a veil, cool and quiet. That evening, as the stars blinked to life one by one, she lit a candle in the scriptorium and studied the rest of the map. The cloister, the spiral, the steps of silence, each had meaning. Each had called her to remember, to feel, to release. And then she saw it. Another mark, near the northern edge of the valley, just beyond the woods. A simple, curved line drawn beside an old oak. It was labeled only the Mirror Tree. She smiled. That night, she dreamed again. She walked barefoot through a shallow stream beneath moonlight. The water glowed pale silver, and lilies floated like stars. A figure waited ahead, tall, robed, indistinct. He held out a hand and whispered, "The story is nearly told." She took his hand. They walked together through the dream, and the world shimmered like silk. The Mirror Tree. Morning light slid softly through the windows, brushing the stone walls in gold. The keep was quiet, more so than usual, as though it too had paused to listen. Isolde rose before the bells, wrapped in her thickest cloak, and set out toward the north woods. She took only a lantern and the map. The path wound past frost-kissed fields, through rows of bare apple trees and into the trees that whispered with every breeze. This part of the forest had grown dense and old, untouched for years. The air held the scent of moss, cold earth, and ancient bark. After some time, she saw it. The mirror tree stood in a clearing of light. It was massive, broader than any oak she had seen, with bark the color of deep silver and branches that arched like cathedral ceilings. Its roots curled over stone and earth, and nestled in its base was a natural pool, small, still, and perfectly clear. The water reflected everything above, the tree, the clouds, even Isolde herself as she stepped forward and looked down. But what stared back was not quite her. The reflection wore her cloak, her face, her eyes, yet the eyes were older, wiser, a little sadder, a little braver. She knelt beside the water, unsure whether to weep or smile. A sudden breeze passed through the clearing, and leaves spiraled down in slow motion. The wind hummed through the branches like a low voice. Then, again, a whisper, not from behind her, but from the pool itself. To see clearly is to return. Isolde leaned closer. The image changed. She saw her mother's face, not in sadness, but laughing as she once did. She saw her father carving figures from soft wood. She saw herself as a child, running through the orchard with sunlit hair and wild joy. The images came like gentle waves. Memories, yes, but softened, no longer sharp, no longer aching. She sat there for a long time, the breeze wrapping around her like a lullaby. By dusk, she returned to the keep. Brother Harlan awaited her by the fire, a cup of warmed milk in his hand, and a smile in his eyes. He said nothing, but when she sat beside him, he passed her the cup. They watched the flames dance. After a time, Isolde spoke. "I think the valley is teaching me how to let go." Brother Harlan nodded. "It always has." The fire crackled. Wind sighed against the walls. She leaned her head against the stone, warm from the hearth, and let her eyes close. For the first time in many months, her sleep came not from exhaustion, but from peace. That night, the dream was different. She stood in a field of golden wheat, the sky endless and soft. A woman waited at the far edge. Isolde walked toward her, heart steady. It was her mother, not in sorrow, but in full, radiant, calm, smiling. They said no words, but they stood together, watching the wind move through the stalks, and in the silence between them, forgiveness bloomed like wildflowers. When Isolde awoke, the candle had burned low beside her, and dawn light touched the edges of the chamber. Later that morning, as she passed the scriptorium, she found something strange. A folded note had been left on the table, sealed with no name. Inside was a short message written in the handwriting of someone she did not know. "When the bell tolls 12, the veil will lift. Come to the chapel." There was no signature. She stared at the note for a long while, and then she waited for the bell. The veil will lift. The hour before noon passed slowly. Isolde walked the keep's hallways in silence. Sunlight spilled through tall windows in soft patterns. Every door she passed felt more like a memory than a threshold. Every candle flame a small soul holding vigil. At the 12th bell, the air shifted. She made her way toward the old chapel, its narrow passage cool and still. The door creaked as she opened it, but no one turned. The pews were empty. The altar was bare. And yet, the space felt full. At the center of the chapel, where light fell from a high stained glass window, stood a single veil, thin and pale like morning mist. It hung between two stone pillars, reaching floor to ceiling, unmoving though the air around it stirred. Isolde approached slowly. No wind, no sound. She reached out, and her fingers brushed fabric that wasn't fabric. It felt like water and smoke and memory all at once, gentle but humming with meaning. Then it shimmered, not like it moved, but like it saw her. A soft voice came from behind. "It has waited for you." She turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, cloaked in simple wool, her hair white as frost. "I don't know you," Isolde said softly. The woman smiled. "And yet, I've known you your whole life. Are you from the village?" The woman stepped forward. She said to him, "I am from the valley. We are part of what remains, part of what watches. This place remembers what the world forgets." She nodded toward the veil. "This is not a wall, it is a passage." Isolde's heart stirred like a quiet bell. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You will." And with that the woman faded, not vanished, but stepped backward into a place beyond sight, as though she had never truly been separate from the air, the stone. The silence. Isolde stood before the veil alone. She breathed deeply and stepped through. The world beyond was light, not bright, but soft and silver, like moonlight through fog. She stood in a space that was neither indoors nor out. She heard the distant sound of water, birds, bells. Figures moved slowly in the distance, each wrapped in soft light. They did not speak, but they turned toward her in greeting. She walked quietly along the path that had formed beneath her feet, grassless and smooth, lined with wildflowers that glowed gently in blue and lavender hues. Then she saw him, her father. He stood beneath a weeping willow, its branches swaying, though no wind touched them. She stopped. He looked at her and smiled. No words, only the embrace. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they sat side by side on a bench beneath the tree. He held her hand as he used to when she was small. No questions, no answers, only a presence that filled the silence like music. Then, as the dreamlight shifted, he spoke. "Home is not a place," he said. "It is where the heart can rest." She nodded. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "You always have." He touched her forehead gently, and everything turned to starlight. When she opened her eyes again, she was kneeling in the chapel, before the same stone pillars. The veil was gone, but the warmth remained. Her heart no longer raced, her breath was slow, her hands steady. She rose, walked quietly back to her room, and sat at the window. Outside, a new snow had begun to fall, light and patient, softening the earth like a lullaby. She watched it until sleep came again, and this time it was dreamless. The quiet return. Winter passed slowly through the valley. Snow fell often, blanketing the orchard and chapel, softening stone and soil alike. The air was hushed, calm as a deep breath held in prayer. Within the keep, Isolde moved like a shadow of light, her presence peaceful, her footsteps soft. She had changed. The sadness that once clung to her like damp linen had begun to lift, not all at once, but in gentle layers. Each morning felt a little warmer, each evening less heavy. The past no longer haunted her. It visited her gently, through memory, not pain. The villagers began to speak of her differently. Where once they had whispered of the noble woman in mourning, now they spoke of the Lady of the Willow. Children brought her dried lavender bundles. Old farmers greeted her as she passed on her way to the forest. Even Brother Harlan, ever stoic, called her a keeper of quiet things. One morning, just before the frost broke, Isolde returned to the mirror tree. She brought no lantern this time, no scroll, no burden, only her heart. The clearing was just as she remembered it. Silver bark, still pool, whispering branches. She knelt again beside the water. Her reflection looked back at her, not older, not younger, simply whole. In the mirror surface, she saw the life that had been and the life still waiting. She no longer needed the veil to feel close to those she had lost. They lived in her breath, in the candle she lit each evening, in the warmth that lingered after prayer. And most of all, they lived in the choices she made to heal, to listen, to love again. As spring awoke across the valley, so did the keep. Windows were opened. Fires burned less brightly. Birds returned to the orchard, building nests between blossoms. And one quiet day, Isolde opened the doors of the keep to welcome travelers. Not nobles, not knights, just souls seeking refuge. A mother and her children fleeing a cruel storm, a healer searching for shelter, an old storyteller who had nowhere left to go. They were fed, warned, and given rest. They stayed as long as they needed. Some left with the fall. Others stayed to help tend the land. Slowly, Willow Keep became more than a memory. It became a home again. On the first day of May, Isolde walked alone to the chapel. She lit a candle beneath the stained glass window, knelt in stillness, and whispered thanks. Not just for her family, not just for her healing, but for the quiet gift of learning how to let go and still remain whole. As the flame danced, a breeze passed through the chapel, though no doors were open. It carried a whisper, like a sigh, like a lullaby, and she smiled. That night, in the hush of her room, she sat by the window as moonlight poured across the floor. She wrapped herself in her cloak, lay upon the bed, and closed her eyes. She dreamed of nothing, just peace, and sleep held her gently, like the arms of an old friend. The end.